This is the house where Jane Jacobs lived in Toronto from 1971 until her death in 2006. Jane Jacobs is probably the most influential urbanist thinker and activist of the past century. She fought against destructive highway and urban renewal projects in New York and Toronto, championed mixed use and walkable neighborhoods, and introduced concepts like eyes on the street that continue to be relevant today. But her legacy isn't entirely positive. Not all of her activism was sympathetic. Some of it is what we would today call NIMBYism. For example, she fought against an addition to a private boys' school near her house, actually wanting the school to pack up and leave the neighborhood. And her ideas and writings were definitely taken as ammunition and justification by a generation of activists skeptical of any neighborhood change, who see themselves as the underdog standing up to power even as their home values climb well into the millions.
Is Vancouver going to turn into a developer's Disneyland where we just listen to developers, or are we going to listen to people that actually own property here and have lived here all their lives?
In this video, we're going to cover the complicated legacy of the most important urbanist figure of our time. Jane Jacobs lived in the Annex, a neighborhood just beyond the edge of downtown Toronto that also happens to be where we lived for most of our half-decade in the city. We used to hang out at this park down the street from her house and slightly improve our mediocre 5K run times on these streets. In the 1950s, plans were drawn up to build a 4 to 8 lane sunken highway down Spadina Road in the middle of the neighborhood that would have looked something like this highway in Montreal. The Spadina Expressway was part of a bigger network planned for the Toronto region that mirrored highway plans for cities across North America and Europe at the time. Jane moved to the city from New York in 1968 and added her voice to a growing opposition, writing an influential op-ed in 1969 called "A City Getting Hooked on the Expressway Drug." She argued against the Los Angelization of Toronto, referencing the California city that even 50 years ago had famously bad traffic despite an extensive network of highways. She identified the central contradiction of urban highways. They promised easy access to downtown for suburban commuters at the expense of making downtown a worse place to actually visit and especially live. The suburbanites are visualizing a journey to the same downtown they already know, maybe even to an improved version of it. But as the expressways, interchanges, and parking lots downtown proliferate, as the local streets grow ever more congested and the pollution and noise intensify, the quality of the inner city deteriorates. The suburbanite is even cheated of his dream of a swift journey if he travels during commuting hours. Faced with mounting pressure, the forward-thinking Conservative Premier of Ontario cancelled the project, saying that the Spadina Expressway would have served the automobile, not the people. A portion was completed in the north, but it was smaller than initially planned and ends here at Eglinton Avenue. The Annex and nearby neighborhoods were saved in a move that helped Toronto avoid the same depths of urban decline experienced by a lot of American cities. The amazing thing about Jane Jacobs is that she was an advocate for density and urban living at a time when cities were not fashionable and people thought the future was in the suburbs. All over North America and Europe, older buildings and neighborhoods were being demolished en masse to build highways and parking lots to serve suburban commuters. For those who remained, planners sought to bring order and suburban sensibilities to the messy city with large-scale projects like Stuytown in Manhattan, which bulldozed an existing neighborhood for a new development that broke sharply with the urban fabric and street grid. Planners saw themselves as cleaning up the city, but Jane saw these urban renewal projects as a rejection of the spontaneous order of cities that would kill neighborhood vitality and street life. The defeat of the Spadina Expressway contributed to a paradigm shift in Toronto's politics and planning culture in the 1970s towards local control and community engagement, and the Expressway wasn't the only thing residents saw as overreach. Toronto also had a boom in apartment construction in the 1960s. If you've ever tried to rent an affordable place in the city, you've probably lived in one of these apartments, but at the time, people were upset. City Hall is controlled by the land development industry, explained John Sewell, an activist who would become mayor a few years later. If we don't keep our neighborhoods, this city will become another Manhattan, argued Colin Vaughan, elected alderman or city councillor in '72. Conservative ratepayer or taxpayer groups forged an alliance with radical tenant organizers, and the city took a turn towards protecting neighborhoods from development with height limits, floor space limits, heritage protection, and a much stronger role for community engagement and input. Starting in 1969, the Annex Residents Association took stands against invasions by builders of apartment high-rises and proponents of expressways. Construction fell off a cliff, especially in established neighborhoods. Apartments that previously got built in places like the Annex were no longer allowed. In the late 70s, developers wanted to build another high-rise here, but residents fought back and got an alternative infill development of just 4 stories that was finished in 1981. It's more appealing than the alternative of another tedious apartment high-rise. Explained 2004 history book of the Annex that captured the mood of a lot of residents. This 1969 building in the Annex is 22 stories, but when it came to redeveloping the surface parking lot in the early 2000s, the developer was only allowed to build up to 6 stories on the main road and 3-story stacked townhouses on the residential street. And even that was controversial and went beyond what was allowed by the zoning. By this point, Toronto's neighborhoods were considered physically stable areas, and any new development had to respect and reinforce the physical patterns and character of nearby properties. The result of clamping down on apartments is that these neighborhoods stagnated and even lost population since the 1970s, and underwent substantial gentrification. Rooming houses for people on modest incomes got converted into single-family homes for the middle class, and then gradually their kids moved out and family sizes in general got smaller. Not enough new apartments were added to maintain the population, let alone keep up with the province's population growth, leaving the Annex to shrink and become more exclusive. Jane Jacobs' own 5-bedroom home was a rooming house that they bought and renovated along those lines. Today it has an estimated value of more than $2 million, with a monthly mortgage payment of $11,000, accessible only to a small slice of the population or people old enough to have bought in early. And that estimate might even be low. We came across this sign for an open house for another property in the neighborhood. Actual sale price? $3.75 million. Mortgage payment? $22,000 a month. People sounded the alarm at the time. The result is going to be one hell of a housing shortage, said a representative of the development industry in '74. John Sewell, one of the neighborhood protection reformers who was mayor from 78 to 80, says that they decided to tackle the rising rents in the 70s by asking the province for rent control, which even he acknowledged in his book further harmed housing construction and contributed to the later turn towards building condos instead of rentals. He also talks about realizing the problems of low-density suburbs for transportation and city finances, but laments his lonely campaign against sprawl. He had a much easier time finding community members to fight against new apartments in the city than to fight against new subdivisions over farmland. Ironically, rising housing costs in the city were exactly the reason given by the province for approving new suburban subdivisions. This story is not unique to Toronto. Lots of other cities from San Francisco to Vancouver experienced a backlash against urban development in the 1970s that was partly inspired by Jane and her work. Former Mayor of Vancouver, Sam Sullivan, says that her ideas and followers have a legacy of high house prices and sprawl, using the neighborhood veto to fight density in desirable central areas.
And, I was such a big fan of hers, but over time, as I tried to densify Vancouver, I ran into people who were advocates of Jane Jacobs' ideas. And I realized then that there were some negative parts of it as well as positive. Stopping the densification, stopping the towers, vetoing change. And from the mid-'70s, we got these rising house prices. I thought that the whole revolution of the 60s and 70s was a pro-density revolution. In fact, I discovered it was a suburban revolution. It stopped the density, the city was downzoned, and, we still have suburbs right in the middle of the city. Our economy is suffering because we can't attract talent to the city because housing is so expensive.
But she definitely shaped Toronto's path, directly and indirectly. Her role wasn't always obstructive. She had some input on the plan for the downtown Eaton Centre Mall. But she contributed to her fair share of fights, successful and not. She and other activists successfully blocked construction of apartments here in the 70s, but failed to quote-unquote save the neighborhood of Yorkville and block this 18-story condo building in the early 2000s. Former Mayor John Sewell said that City Council sold out the neighborhood in approving it. Having her as part of the demonstrating crowd provided considerable comfort, explains Sewell. But even when not directly involved, her ideas permeated in the background. She strongly stood up for local control and explicitly defended those accused of NIMBYism. Nearly always when people object, it's something that shouldn't be in anybody's backyard. In a 1999 interview, she outlined a principle that she called "not a sparrow should fall." That means that no planning should hurt anyone in the neighborhood. Nothing should be at the expense of others. You don't need what planners call trade-offs. You can avoid one-win situations. It takes some ingenuity, but if it's going to hurt somebody, there is something wrong with it. And you would need to find out how to do it without hurting anybody. You can see how this attitude might develop in a context of fighting back against wholesale forcible demolition of entire neighborhoods by the government. But from a modern perspective, it's entirely too charitable to NIMBYs to take their complaints as legitimate by default. Forget apartments, a significant portion of the population doesn't believe that duplexes should be allowed to exist in their neighborhoods. And the rejection of trade-offs comes across as surprisingly naive. There will always be someone who sees themselves as harmed or inconvenienced by a new development or change, whether in terms of aesthetics, shadows, traffic, or people they don't like moving into the neighborhood. Rigidly avoiding those things doesn't eliminate harm. It just biases you towards a smaller development or no development at all, which squeezes the housing market, prices people out, and encourages sprawl. Like former Mayor Sewell noticed, suburban subdivisions don't get NIMBY'd like apartments in existing neighborhoods do. In that same 1999 interview, she covered gentrification, explaining how it's all about supply and demand. But rather than talking about the supply of housing within these neighborhoods, she talks about the supply of these neighborhoods. If places like the Annex are too expensive, it's because there aren't enough of them and we should focus on creating more. On one hand, yes, we should try to apply successful principles from these places to new developments. But also a lot of the appeal of a place like the Annex is the location. It's within easy walking distance of the biggest university in the country, and within easy cycling or transit distance of the biggest job center in the country. It's connected on not just one subway line, but 2 subway lines and 2 streetcar routes. This area is way too valuable in infrastructure and amenities to reserve so much of it for multi-million-dollar homes. You could replicate the exact same pleasant streets of the Annex in a new subdivision, and it wouldn't have the same desirability or appeal because it would lack this proximity and infrastructure. Hold on a second, a skeptical resident might say. Apartments really would harm quality of life here, just like the Spadina Expressway would have. You shouldn't destroy a neighborhood just to allow more people to live there. Okay, but there are already apartments there, just mainly older ones. Having lived there, we never felt bothered by them. They were just a normal part of the neighborhood. Do others disagree? If they really do harm quality of life in such a profound way, should we hope to start demolishing them? Like this one, can we tear it down and replace it with a few nice 5-bedroom houses like the one Jane Jacobs lived in? While many people live here, their building harms everyone else and it needs to go away. They need to go away. When can we start demolition of this monstrosity, this insult to the neighborhood? Well, it turns out that you can't, certainly not very easily. This apartment is heritage designated. Its cultural heritage value comes from its height and unusual detailing, which makes it a highly visible building. Normally it's considered a bad thing for apartments to stand out, but here it's given as a reason for heritage protection. Other buildings in the neighborhood are heritage listed, which is one step below heritage designation. When a new government bill threatened that status, the Annex Residents Association fought back, referring to this apartment building as a fanciful gem, one of the hallmarks of our community. So we find ourselves in a weird situation where new apartment buildings are bad and threatening to quality of life. But don't you dare touch our old apartment buildings, those are the hallmarks of our community. This kind of story is not new. The very earliest apartment buildings in Toronto, like this one from 1907, sparked a backlash and rules making them harder to build. But then later on they became normal and even treasured parts of the community, and got heritage listed and designated. And now, because where you can build apartments is so limited, developers are set to build a 10-story addition on top of it. It's not the most straightforward project, but because so much of the neighborhood and city is off limits to apartments, sometimes you end up building apartments on top of apartments. If you're watching this video and you're hung up on height, the point isn't about high-rise apartments specifically. We don't really share the aversion that some people have to tall buildings, especially when they're near transit, but we can say this. If it had remained easy to build even mid-rise apartments, 5 to 10 stories, throughout Toronto's neighborhoods since the 70s, the city would be in a much better position today. But that's not what happened. A lot of places can claim influence of Jane in her work, but it's hard to overstate how much her ideas permeate the city and neighborhood where she lived for more than a third of her life. Around the annex, you can find plaques commemorating her and identifying the Spadina Expressway fight as a pivotal shift in Toronto politics. Back when we lived here, we saw a showing of Citizen Jane battle for the city at a local theater. Jane's walks, which are now all over the world, started here. And the last time we were briefly in the city to get some of this footage, we actually heard a random person in a park talking about her. It would be easy to end this video by dismissing Jane Jacobs as some NIMBY villain, but that wouldn't be quite right. There's a lot to like in her thinking, even from a pro-housing urbanist perspective. For example, she talked a lot about the spontaneous order of cities and didn't especially like planners or strict zoning. She loved dense, mixed-use neighborhoods and wasn't even as afraid of tall buildings as many of her followers. But her valorization of local control, community engagement, and the neighborhood veto hasn't held up as well. To be fair, it made more sense at the time. The era of urban renewal and urban highways was full of genuine government overreach and design mistakes. Empowering local communities and giving residents the final say was an understandable response, even if it went too far. But we've run up against a problem that, as far as we can tell, Jane Jacobs didn't really reckon with when she stressed that the people who live in a community know best how to run it. What if existing residents, or at least the ones with time on their hands to be involved in this stuff, don't want any more neighbors? What if they want their home values to rise? What if they want strict planning and zoning controls? What if they don't really care about pricing people out or supercharging suburban sprawl? We've had decades of experience now that asking comfortably housed residents whether their neighborhood needs any more housing tends to result in a lot of no's. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.